In the vast untamed wilderness of Yellowstone National Park, where geysers erupt with primal force and grizzly bears roam free, a story of love, loss, and a 15-year-old secret began on a crisp autumn day in 2009. It was a story that would captivate a nation, baffle investigators, and ultimately reveal a truth more shocking than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of David and Sarah Miller, a young couple from Ohio who vanished without a trace, and their daughter Emily, who refused to let their memory fade. It's a story that asks a haunting question. In a place as wild as Yellowstone, is it possible for two people to simply disappear, or was something far more sinister at play? If you've ever been captivated by a mystery that seems impossible to solve, if you believe that the truth can stay hidden for years but never forever, or if you simply want to know what really happened to the Millers, then you need to hear this story. Because the discovery made 15 years after they disappeared didn't just solve a cold case. It rewrote history. Before we begin, if you know someone who has ever been touched by a story of loss and the search for answers, please share this with them. And if you want to be the first to know when we uncover the truth behind the world's greatest mysteries, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Yellowstone vanishing. To understand the mystery, we must first go back to that fateful day in September 2009, when David and Sarah Miller, along with their 12-year-old daughter Emily, embarked on what was supposed to be the family vacation of a lifetime. David Miller, 35, was a high school history teacher with a passion for the American West. Sarah Miller, 34, was a botanist who dreamed of seeing the unique flora of Yellowstone. Emily, their only child, was a bright and curious 12-year-old who had inherited her parents' love for adventure. They were a picture-perfect family, full of life and excitement as they drove their rented RV into the heart of one of America's most iconic landscapes. Their first few days in the park were filled with wonder. They watched Old Faithful erupt, marveled at the vibrant colors of the Grand Prismatic Spring, and hiked through forests of towering lodgepole pines. David documented every moment with his camera, while Sarah collected leaf samples for her research. Emily, for her part, was captivated by the wildlife, keeping a detailed journal of every bison, elk, and coyote she saw. On the morning of September 15, 2009, they decided to hike the Fairy Falls Trail, a popular 5-mile round trip that offered stunning views of the park's largest waterfall. It was a relatively easy hike, well-traveled and clearly marked. There was no reason to suspect that this ordinary day would soon turn into an extraordinary mystery. "Ready for an adventure, Em?" David asked, ruffling his daughter's hair. "Always," she replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Don't forget your water bottle," Sarah reminded her. Ever the practical one. They set off from the trailhead around 10 a.m. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the trail was dotted with other hikers. David and Sarah walked hand in hand, with Emily skipping ahead, pointing out interesting rocks and flowers. They were a happy family, completely unaware that they were walking towards a fate that would separate them forever. Around noon, they reached Fairy Falls. The sight was breathtaking, a 200-foot cascade of water plunging into a crystal-clear pool. They stopped for lunch, sitting on a large rock and enjoying the sandwiches Sarah had packed. David took several photos of Sarah and Emily, capturing their smiling faces against the backdrop of the majestic waterfall. These would be the last photos ever taken of them. After lunch, they decided to continue on a less-traveled path that led to Imperial Geyser. It was a slightly more challenging hike, but David, ever the adventurer, was eager to explore. Sarah, though more cautious, agreed, her botanist's curiosity piqued by the promise of seeing a more remote part of the park. It was on this path that the first sign of trouble appeared. According to other hikers who were in the area, the Millers were seen having a heated discussion with two men. The men were described as being in their late 40s, dressed in rugged outdoor gear and carrying large backpacks. They didn't look like typical tourists. They looked like they belonged in the wilderness. One hiker, a retired police officer from California, later told investigators that he overheard snippets of the conversation. It seemed to be about a map. David was holding a map, and the two men were pointing at it, their voices low and intense. The hiker didn't think much of it. At the time, disputes over directions were common on the trails, but in hindsight, he remembered the tension in the air, the way the two men seemed to be cornering David and Sarah. Another hiker, a young woman from Germany, reported seeing the Millers a short time later, walking quickly away from the two men. She said they looked scared and upset. Sarah was holding Emily's hand tightly, and David kept looking over his shoulder, as if he was being followed. This was the last confirmed sighting of David and Sarah Miller. They never returned to their RV. They never checked out of their campsite. They simply vanished. When the Millers failed to return by nightfall, Emily, who had stayed behind at the RV to read, began to worry. She knew her parents were experienced hikers, but it was getting dark and cold. She tried calling their cell phones, but there was no service in that part of the park. At 8 p.m., she finally gathered the courage to approach a park ranger. "My parents went hiking this morning, and they haven't come back," she said, her voice trembling. The park ranger, a seasoned veteran named Tom Jenkins, tried to reassure her. "Sometimes hikers lose track of time," he said. "I'm sure they'll be back soon." But as the hours ticked by, it became clear that this was not a simple case of lost hikers. A search and rescue operation was launched at dawn the next day. Dozens of park rangers, volunteers, and search dogs scoured the Ferry, Falls Trail, and the surrounding area. Helicopters flew overhead, their searchlights cutting through the dense forest, but they found nothing. No footprints, no discarded water bottles, no signs of a struggle. It was as if David and Sarah Miller had been erased from the face of the earth. The only clue was their RV, which was found locked and undisturbed at the trailhead. Inside, investigators found their wallets, credit cards, and cell phones. Everything was in its place, except for David's camera and the map he had been seen with. The search continued for weeks, growing into one of the largest in Yellowstone's history. The story of the missing couple from Ohio captured the nation's attention. News crews descended on the park, broadcasting live from the search headquarters. The faces of David and Sarah Miller were plastered on every news channel, their smiling photos a stark contrast to the grim reality of their disappearance. But despite the massive effort, no trace of them was ever found. The search was eventually scaled back and then officially called off. The official explanation was that the Millers had likely gotten lost, succumbed to the elements, or had a fatal encounter with a wild animal. It was a plausible explanation in a place as vast and dangerous as Yellowstone. But for Emily, and for the investigators who worked the case, it never felt right. "There are too many unanswered questions," said lead investigator Frank Thompson in a press conference. Why would they leave their wallets and phones behind? What happened to the camera and the map? And who were the two men they were seen arguing with? Those two men became the focus of the investigation. Sketches were created based on the hikers' descriptions and circulated nationwide, but no one came forward. The men, like the Millers, seemed to have vanished into thin air. For Emily, the years that followed were a blur of grief and uncertainty. She went to live with her grandparents in Ohio, trying to piece together a life that had been shattered, but she never gave up hope. She spent her teenage years reading everything she could find about Yellowstone, about survival in the wilderness, about unsolved mysteries. She became an expert on her own parents' case, memorizing every detail, every witness statement, every dead end. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that her parents had not simply gotten lost. They had been taken, and she was determined to find out why. As she grew older, her determination only intensified. She went to college and studied journalism, honing the skills she would need to conduct her own investigation. She learned how to file Freedom of Information Act requests, how to track down witnesses, how to see through the official narrative and find the hidden truths. 15 years passed. The case of the Yellowstone vanishing grew cold. The news crews moved on to other stories. The world forgot about David and Sarah Miller, but Emily never did. In the summer of 2024, now a 27-year-old investigative journalist, Emily returned to Yellowstone. She was no longer the scared 12-year-old who had lost her parents. She was a woman on a mission. She was there to find the answers that had eluded investigators for 15 years. She was there to find out what really happened to her parents. She didn't know it at the time, but her investigation would uncover a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, a secret that had been buried for decades, and a truth that was far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The first stop on Emily's investigation was the park's archives, a dusty basement filled with old case files. She spent days poring over the documents from her parents' case, looking for anything the original investigators might have missed. It was tedious work, but Emily was meticulous. She cross-referenced witness statements, studied topographical maps, and analyzed the search and rescue logs. It was in a box of unsorted evidence that she found her first break. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, overlooked in the initial investigation. It was her father's field journal. David, the history teacher, had been a meticulous note-taker. He had filled the journal with observations about the park's history, geology, and wildlife. But as Emily read through the entries from the days leading up to his disappearance, she noticed a change in his tone. His notes became more cryptic, filled with strange symbols and references to old mining claims. He wrote about a hidden treasure and a secret that must be protected. The last entry, dated the morning of September 15th, 2009, was the most chilling of all. "Found it," he wrote. "The map was right, but we're not alone. They're watching us. S knows. We have to get out. S. Sarah, her mother." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Proof this she had been looking for. This was the... Her parents hadn't gotten lost. They had found something. Something that someone was willing to kill for. But what was it? What was the hidden treasure? And who were they? Emily's investigation took her to the local library in Cody, Wyoming, a small town on the outskirts of Yellowstone. She spent hours searching through old newspapers and historical records, looking for any mention of mining claims in the area of Fairy Falls. She found nothing. Frustrated, she was about to give up when she stumbled upon a collection of old, hand-drawn maps from the late 1800s. One of them, created by a prospector named Jedediah Smith, caught her eye. It showed a network of tunnels and shafts in the exact area where her parents had disappeared. The map was labeled the Devil's Vein. According to local legend, the Devil's Vein was a lost gold mine, rumored to hold a fortune in gold nuggets, but it was also said to be cursed. Jedediah Smith, the man who created the map, had gone mad and died in poverty, and everyone who had searched for the mine since had met with a similar fate. Could this be the hidden treasure her father had written about? It seemed far-fetched, but it was the only lead she had. Emily's next step was to find someone who knew about the local legends, someone who had been around long enough to remember the stories of the Devil's Vein. She found that person in a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. His name was Silas Blackwood, a grizzled old prospector in his late 70s, with eyes that had seen more than their fair share of secrets. "The Devil's Vein," he said, his voice a low growl. "Haven't heard that name in a long time." "Do you know where it is?" Emily asked. "I know where it's supposed to be, but no one's ever found it, or at least no one's ever come back to talk about it." Emily showed him her father's journal and the old map. Silas's eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" asked. "It was my father's." "Your father was David Miller?" Emily nodded. Silas leaned back in his chair, a look of understanding on his face. "Now it all makes sense," he said. "What makes sense?" "Your parents didn't get lost, kid. They found it, and they paid the price." Silas then told her a story that made her blood run cold. He said that the Devil's Vein was more than just a lost gold mine. It was a front for a powerful and secretive organization, a group of wealthy, influential men who used the mine for their own illicit activities. He didn't know what those activities were, but he knew they were dangerous. He called them the Guardians. "They've been protecting that mine for generations," he said. "They'll do anything to keep it a secret. Anyone who gets too close, they disappear." He then told her about the two men her parents were seen with. He knew them. They were enforcers for the Guardians, a pair of ruthless brothers named Hank and Jedediah Stone. They were known in the local community as men to be feared, men who operated outside the law. "If your parents ran into the Stone brothers," Silas said, his voice grim, "they never stood a chance." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Her parents had stumbled upon a dangerous secret, and the Guardians had silenced them, but she still had no proof. She had a journal, a map, and the word of an old prospector. It wasn't enough. She needed to find the mine. She needed to find out what the Guardians were hiding. She needed to find the truth. Armed with her father's journal and the old map, Emily set out to do what no one had done before: find the Devil's Vein. She knew it was dangerous, but she was not afraid. She was her parents' daughter, and she would not rest until she had justice for them. She hired a local guide, a young and capable woman named Maya, and together they ventured into the remote backcountry of Yellowstone, following the cryptic clues left behind by her father. It was a grueling journey, through dense forests and treacherous canyons, but Emily was driven by a force more powerful than any obstacle: a daughter's love for her lost parents. After days of searching, they found it, a hidden entrance to a mine, concealed behind a waterfall. It was exactly where the old map said it would be. The air was cold and damp, and a sense of dread hung over the place. But Emily knew she had to go inside. What she found in the mine was more shocking than any lost treasure. It was not a gold mine. It was a sophisticated underground facility filled with computers, laboratory equipment, and documents. It was a secret research lab. As Emily and Maya explored the facility, they began to piece together the horrifying truth. The Guardians were not just a secretive organization. They were a shadow corporation, conducting illegal and unethical experiments, far from the prying eyes of the government. They were developing a biological weapon, a deadly virus that could be used to control populations and manipulate world events. And her parents? They hadn't just stumbled upon the mine. They had been targeted. Her father, the history teacher, had been researching old mining claims and had uncovered the existence of the Devil's Vein. Her mother, the botanist, had been collecting plant samples and had discovered a rare and mutated plant near the mine's entrance, a plant that was a key ingredient in the virus. They had gotten too close to the truth, and the Guardians had silenced them. As Emily was processing this horrifying revelation, she heard a noise, footsteps. Someone was coming. She and Maya quickly hid, their hearts pounding in their chests. 2 men entered the facility. It was them, the Stone brothers. They were older now, their faces hardened by years of violence, but Emily recognized them instantly from the sketches. "The girl is getting close," Hank said, his voice a low growl. "We need to take care of her, just like we took care of her parents," Jedediah added, a cruel smile on his face. Emily's blood ran cold. This was it, the confirmation she had been searching for. These were the men who had murdered her parents. But her fear was quickly replaced by a cold, hard rage. She was not the scared 12-year-old anymore. She was a woman who had spent 15 years searching for the truth, and she was not going to let these men get away with it. What happened next was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Emily and Maya, using their knowledge of the terrain and their wits, managed to ambush the Stone brothers. It was a desperate and violent struggle, but in the end, they prevailed. They subdued the 2 men and tied them up, but their ordeal was not over. As they were about to leave the mine, they were confronted by the leader of the Guardians, a man they had only known as the Director. He was a powerful and influential figure, a man who had operated in the shadows for decades, and he was not about to let his secrets be exposed. He offered Emily a deal, her life, in exchange for her silence. He would give her wealth, power, anything she wanted. All she had to do was walk away and forget everything she had seen. But Emily was not her parents. She was not a victim. She was a survivor, and she was a journalist. She had a recording device in her, and it had been running the entire time. She had everything she needed to expose the Guardians and their crimes to the world. "I'm not interested in your deals," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm interested in justice." In the end, justice prevailed. Emily managed to escape the mine with the evidence and the recording. She went straight to the authorities, and this time, they listened. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, and the truth about the Guardians and their secret lab in Yellowstone was finally exposed. The director and his associates were arrested. The Stone brothers were convicted of the murder of David and Sarah Miller, and the world finally learned what had happened to the couple who had vanished without a trace 15 years earlier. For Emily, it was a bittersweet victory. She had found the truth, but it could not bring her parents back. But in a way, they had never really left her. Their love for adventure, their passion for knowledge, their unwavering sense of right and wrong, these were the things that had guided her on her journey, the things that had given her the strength to never give up. She had not only solved the mystery of their disappearance, she had honored their memory. She had become the person they had always known she would be, a woman of courage, integrity, and an unshakable belief in the power of the truth. The story of the Yellowstone vanishing was over, but the story of Emily Miller, the girl who had refused to let her parents be forgotten, was just beginning, and it was a story that would inspire a generation, a story that proved that even in the face of unimaginable loss, hope can survive, and that even after 15 years of silence, the truth will always find a way to be heard. The search for David and Sarah Miller consumed the resources of multiple agencies for weeks. What had begun as a routine missing persons case quickly escalated into something far more complex and sinister. As the days turned into weeks without any trace of the couple, investigators began to suspect that their disappearance was not the result of a hiking accident or animal attack. Lead investigator Frank Thompson had seen his share of missing persons cases during his 25 years with the National Park Service. He had dealt with lost hikers, suicide cases, and even the occasional murder. But the Miller case was different. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions, and too many people who seemed to know more than they were willing to say. The first breakthrough came when Thompson decided to expand the investigation beyond the immediate area of the disappearance. He began looking into the backgrounds of David and Sarah Miller, searching for any connections that might explain why they had been targeted. What he found was both surprising and deeply troubling. David Miller, the high school history teacher from Ohio, had not been entirely honest about his background. While it was true that he taught history, he had also been conducting extensive research into the early mining history of the American West. His personal computer, which had been seized as evidence, contained thousands of documents related to old mining claims, geological surveys, and historical records dating back to the 1800s. More importantly, David had been in contact with several other researchers who were investigating similar topics. These researchers, scattered across the country, had all been looking into what they called lost mines and hidden treasures in various national parks and wilderness areas. And disturbingly, several of these researchers had also gone missing in recent years. Dr. Patricia Williams, the geologist who had witnessed the Millers' strange behavior at the river, became a key figure in the investigation. When Thompson interviewed her more extensively, she revealed that she had been conducting her own research into the geological anomalies of Yellowstone. She had been particularly interested in areas where the park's unique geothermal activity might have created unusual mineral deposits. David Miller contacted me about 6 months before his disappearance, Dr. Williams told Thompson. He had found some old mining records that suggested there were significant gold deposits in areas that are now part of the park. He wanted to know if I thought the geological evidence supported these claims. "And what did you tell him?" Thompson asked. "I told him that while it was theoretically possible, any mining activity in a national park would be illegal, but he seemed more interested in the historical aspect than any actual treasure hunting." "Did he mention anything about other people being interested in his research?" Dr. Williams hesitated. "He did say that he had been contacted by some people who claimed to represent a historical society. They wanted to see his research, but something about them made him uncomfortable. He said they seemed more like businessmen than historians." This revelation led Thompson to investigate the mysterious historical society that had contacted David Miller. What he found was a web of shell companies and false identities that seemed designed to obscure the true nature of the organization behind them. The deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that David and Sarah Miller had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple treasure hunt. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Thompson received a call from the FBI. Agent Sarah Chen, a specialist in organized crime and conspiracy cases, had been monitoring the Miller investigation from Washington. She had noticed similarities between the Miller case and several other disappearances that had occurred in national parks across the western United States. "We've been tracking a pattern," Agent Chen explained during their first meeting. "Over the past 10 years, at least 15 people have disappeared from national parks under similar circumstances. All of them were researchers, historians, or amateur treasure hunters. All of them had been investigating old mining claims or geological anomalies, and all of them vanished without a trace." "You think there's a connection?" Thompson asked. "I think there's an organization that's willing to kill to protect whatever secret these people were getting close to discovering." Agent Chen brought with her a file that contained information about the other disappearances. The pattern was unmistakable. In each case, the missing person had been conducting research into historical mining activities in areas that were now protected federal land. In each case, they had been contacted by mysterious individuals claiming to represent various legitimate organizations. And in each case, they had vanished shortly after making some kind of breakthrough in their research. The most disturbing case was that of Dr. Michael Torres, a geologist from Colorado who had disappeared from Rocky Mountain National Park 3 years earlier. Like David Miller, Dr. Torres had been researching old mining claims. He had been particularly interested in a legendary mine called the Devil's Vein, which was rumored to contain vast amounts of gold but had never been officially located. Dr. Torres had been in contact with David Miller in the EU months before both of their disappearances. They had been sharing research and comparing notes about their respective investigations. The last email from Dr. Torres to David Miller, sent just 2 weeks before David's disappearance, contained a chilling warning. "I think we're being watched. Be careful who you trust." As the investigation progressed, Thompson and Agent Chen began to piece together the existence of a shadowy organization that they dubbed the Guardians. This group seemed to have extensive resources and connections within various government agencies. They operated through a network of front companies and used sophisticated surveillance techniques to monitor anyone who got too close to their secrets. The Guardians' primary objective appeared to be protecting certain areas of federal land from any kind of development or exploitation, but their methods were far from legal or ethical. They used intimidation, bribery, and when necessary, murder to silence anyone who threatened to expose their activities. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Emily Miller, now 13 years old and living with her grandparents in Ohio, had been conducting her own investigation into her parents' disappearance. Despite her young age, she had inherited her father's research skills and her mother's scientific curiosity. She had been going through her father's personal effects, looking for any clues that the official investigators might have missed. In a box of her father's old college textbooks, Emily found a hidden compartment containing a small digital recorder. The recorder contained several hours of conversations between her father and various people he had been interviewing for his research. Most of the recordings were routine interviews with local historians and retired miners, but the last recording was different. It was a conversation between David Miller and a man who identified himself as Mr. Stone. The conversation had taken place just 3 days before David and Sarah's disappearance. Mr. Stone was clearly trying to convince David to abandon his research, offering him money and even threatening him if he refused to comply. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Mr. Miller," Mr. Stone said on the recording. "There are forces at work here that are much bigger than your little history project. Walk away now, and you and your family will be safe. Continue down this path, and I can't guarantee what will happen." David's response was defiant. "I'm not going to be intimidated by you or anyone else. If there's something important hidden in Yellowstone, the public has a right to know about it." "The public doesn't always know what's best for them," Mr. Stone replied. "Sometimes secrets need to stay buried for the greater good." "Whose greater good?" David asked. "Yours?" The recording ended abruptly, but it provided investigators with their first concrete evidence that David and Sarah Miller had been deliberately targeted. The voice on the recording was analyzed by FBI experts and matched to a man named Hank Stone, a known enforcer for various criminal organizations. Hank Stone and his brother Jedediah were career criminals who specialized in intimidation and violence. They had been linked to several unsolved murders over the years, but had never been successfully prosecuted due to lack of evidence and their connections to powerful people who protected them. The Stone brothers became the primary focus of the investigation. Surveillance teams were assigned to track their movements, and their financial records were scrutinized for any connections to the Guardians organization. What investigators found was a complex web of payments and transactions that led back to a series of offshore accounts controlled by unknown entities. Meanwhile, the search for David and Sarah Miller's bodies continued. The area around Ferry Falls was searched repeatedly using increasingly sophisticated techniques. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, and even psychic investigators were brought in to help locate any trace of the missing couple. But the wilderness of Yellowstone seemed to have swallowed them completely. The case took another dramatic turn when a hiker found a piece of fabric caught on a tree branch about 2 miles from where the Millers were last seen. The fabric was identified as coming from Sarah Miller's jacket, and it was stained with what appeared to be blood. The discovery led to an intensive search of the surrounding area, but no other evidence was found. Forensic analysis of the fabric revealed that the blood was indeed Sarah's, but the pattern of the staining suggested that she had been injured but not necessarily killed. This gave investigators hope that the Millers might still be alive, possibly being held captive somewhere. The investigation expanded to include a search for any properties or facilities that might be controlled by the Guardians organization. This led to the discovery of several remote compounds and research facilities scattered throughout the western United States. Most of these facilities were officially owned by legitimate companies, but investigators suspected that they were actually fronts for the Guardians' operations. One facility in particular caught the attention of investigators. Located in a remote area of Montana, about 200 miles from Yellowstone, the facility was officially listed as a geological research station operated by a company called Western Mining Consultants. But satellite imagery revealed that the facility was much larger and more sophisticated than a simple research station would require. The facility was surrounded by high fences and security cameras, and access was strictly controlled. Attempts to investigate the facility through official channels were blocked by claims of national security and proprietary research. But Agent Chen was convinced that this facility was connected to the Miller disappearance and the broader conspiracy. As the first anniversary of the Millers' disappearance approached, the investigation had reached a frustrating stalemate. Despite having identified the likely perpetrators and uncovered evidence of a broader conspiracy, investigators had been unable to locate the missing couple or gather enough evidence to make arrests. The case had attracted national media attention, and pressure was mounting on law enforcement agencies to produce results. Emily Miller, now 14, had become a vocal advocate for her parents, appearing on television shows and giving interviews to keep their story in the public eye. "I know my parents are still alive," Emily said during one particularly emotional interview, "and I know that someone out there knows what happened to them. I'm not going to give up until I find the truth." Emily's determination and media savvy had made her a powerful force in keeping the case alive. She had also been conducting her own investigation, using social media and online forums to connect with other families who had lost loved ones under similar circumstances. Through these connections, she had uncovered additional evidence that supported the theory of a broader conspiracy. The breakthrough that investigators had been waiting for finally came from an unexpected source. A former employee of Western Mining Consultants contacted the FBI with information about the company's true activities. The whistleblower, who insisted on anonymity for fear of retaliation, revealed that the Montana facility was not a research station at all, but rather a detention and interrogation center. According to the whistleblower, the facility was used to hold people who had gotten too close to discovering the Guardian's secrets. These individuals were subjected to intense interrogation and psychological manipulation designed to break their will and force them to abandon their research. In some cases, when the subjects proved too resistant or too dangerous to release, they were permanently silenced. The whistleblower claimed to have seen David and Sarah Miller at the facility in the months following their disappearance. They had been held in separate cells and subjected to daily interrogation sessions. The goal was to force David to reveal the location of all his research materials and to identify anyone else who might be investigating similar topics. They were trying to map out the entire network of researchers and treasure hunters, the whistleblower explained. They wanted to know everyone who might pose a threat to their operations. According to the whistleblower, David Miller had proven to be remarkably resistant to the interrogation techniques. Despite months of psychological pressure and physical deprivation, he had refused to cooperate with his captors. Sarah, meanwhile, had been used as leverage against her husband, with threats to her safety being used to try to break David's resolve. The information provided by the whistleblower gave investigators the evidence they needed to obtain search warrants for the Montana facility. A joint operation involving the FBI, local law enforcement, and military personnel was planned to raid the facility and rescue any prisoners who might be held there. But when the raid was finally executed, the facility was found to be empty. The Guardians had apparently been tipped off about the impending operation and had evacuated the site. All equipment had been removed, and any evidence of the facility's true purpose had been destroyed. However, the raid was not entirely unsuccessful. Hidden in a ventilation shaft, investigators found a small cache of documents that had been overlooked during the evacuation. These documents provided detailed information about the Guardians' operations, including lists of targets, financial records, and communication logs. Most importantly, the documents revealed the location of another facility, this one located in a remote area of Nevada. According to the documents, this facility was the Guardians' primary research and detention center, and it was where their most important prisoners were held. The Nevada facility was much more heavily fortified than the Montana site. It was located in an area that was officially designated as a military testing range, which provided an additional layer of security and legal protection. Any attempt to approach the facility would require careful planning and coordination with military authorities. As investigators prepared for what they hoped would be the final phase of their operation, Emily Miller was making preparations of her own. Now 15 years old and more determined than ever to find her parents, she had been secretly planning her own rescue mission. Emily had used her media connections and online research skills to gather intelligence about the Guardians and their operations. She had also been in contact with other families affected by similar disappearances, and together they had formed an informal network of investigators and activists. Through this network, Emily had learned about the Nevada facility and its location. She had also made contact with a group of former military personnel who were sympathetic to her cause and willing to help with a rescue operation. The plan that Emily and her allies developed was audacious and dangerous. They would infiltrate the Nevada facility during a planned military exercise that would provide cover for their approach. Once inside, they would locate and rescue the prisoners, including David and Sarah Miller. The operation was scheduled to take place on the second anniversary of the Millers' disappearance. Emily saw this timing as symbolic. It would mark the end of her family's ordeal and the beginning of justice for all the victims of the Guardians' conspiracy. As the date approached, both the official investigation and Emily's unofficial rescue mission were moving toward their climactic confrontations with the Guardians. The stage was set for a final showdown that would determine the fate of David and Sarah Miller and expose the truth about one of the most sinister conspiracies in American history. Chapter 3. The Rescue Mission, the Nevada. Desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that seemed designed to discourage human presence. It was in this desolate environment that the Guardians had built their most secure facility, confident that its remote location and military protection would keep their secrets safe forever. But they had not counted on the determination of a teenage girl who refused to accept the loss of her parents or the network of allies she had assembled in her quest for justice. Emily Miller, now 16 and hardened by 2 years of investigation and advocacy, crouched behind a rocky outcrop about a mile from the facility's perimeter. She was dressed in military-style camouflage and carried a backpack filled with surveillance equipment and communication devices. Her face, once soft with childhood innocence, now bore the determined expression of someone who had seen too much and lost too much to be deterred by fear. Beside her were three men who had become her unlikely allies in this desperate mission. Jake Morrison, the former search and rescue coordinator who had led the original search for her parents, had resigned from the Park Service in frustration over the case's lack of progress. Marcus Webb, a former Navy SEAL who had lost his own brother to the Guardians conspiracy, brought military expertise and tactical knowledge to the group, and Dr. Patricia Williams, the geologist who had witnessed her parents' disappearance, provided scientific knowledge and a deep understanding of the Guardians' operations. "The facility is larger than we expected," Jake whispered, studying the complex through high-powered binoculars. "I count at least 12 buildings, plus what looks like an underground entrance." "The documents we recovered mentioned multiple levels," Dr. Williams added. "The detention cells are probably underground, which would make them harder to locate and more difficult to escape from." Marcus was studying a tablet computer that displayed real-time satellite imagery of the facility. "Security is tight, but not impossible. I count 6 guard towers, regular patrols, and what looks like a sophisticated sensor network around the perimeter." Emily took the binoculars and studied the facility herself. Somewhere in that complex of buildings and underground tunnels, her parents were being held prisoner. After 2 years of searching and investigating, she was finally close enough to touch the place where they were being kept. "How do we get inside?" she asked. Marcus pointed to a section of the perimeter fence that was partially hidden by a small hill. "There's a blind spot in their sensor coverage right there. If we can reach that point without being detected, we can cut through the fence and make our way to the main building." "And then what?" Jake asked. "We can't just walk in and start searching. This place probably has hundreds of rooms and corridors." Dr. Williams pulled out a set of architectural drawings that had been included in the documents recovered from the Montana facility. "According to these plans, the detention area is located on the 3rd sublevel. There's an elevator in the main building that provides access, but it's probably secured and monitored. There's also a service tunnel that connects the main building to the underground levels," Marcus noted, studying the drawings. "It's used for utilities and maintenance. If we can access that tunnel, we might be able to reach the detention area without going through the main security checkpoints." Emily studied the plans carefully, memorizing every detail. She had spent months preparing for this moment, learning about building layouts, security systems, and rescue techniques. She was as ready as she could possibly be. "What about getting out?" she asked. "Even if we find my parents and the other prisoners, how do we get them out of the facility into safety?" "That's where the military exercise comes in," Marcus explained. "There's a scheduled training operation happening about 10 miles from here. The noise and activity will provide cover for our escape, and we have allies in the military who will be ready to provide assistance if needed." The plan was risky and complex, with dozens of things that could go wrong. But Emily had learned that sometimes the only way to achieve justice was to take extraordinary risks. Her parents had taken a risk when they decided to investigate the Guardians' secrets, and now it was her turn to take a risk to save them. As darkness fell over the desert, the 4-person rescue team began their approach to the facility. They moved carefully and silently, using night vision equipment to navigate the rocky terrain while avoiding the security patrols that circled the perimeter. The first challenge came when they reached the sensor network that surrounded the facility. The sensors were designed to detect any movement or heat signature within a certain range of the fence. But Marcus had come prepared with specialized equipment that could temporarily disable the sensors without triggering an alarm. Working quickly and quietly, he attached small devices to the sensor posts that would create a localized dead zone in the detection grid. The devices would only work for about 30 minutes before the facility's security system would detect the malfunction, so they had to move fast. Once the sensors were disabled, the team cut through the chain-link fence and slipped inside the facility's perimeter. They found themselves in a compound that was much larger and more complex than it had appeared from a distance. Buildings of various sizes were connected by covered walkways, and the entire complex hummed with the sound of generators and air conditioning systems. Following the architectural plans, they made their way to the main building and located the service tunnel entrance. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, filled with pipes and electrical conduits that made movement difficult, but it provided a hidden route to the underground levels where the prisoners were being held. As they descended deeper into the facility, Emily felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She was closer to her parents than she had been in 2 years, but she was also venturing into the heart of an organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill to protect its secrets. The detention level was a stark and sterile environment that looked more like a medical facility than a prison. Long corridors lined with heavy metal doors stretched in both directions, and the air was filled with the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of voices. "There must be dozens of cells down here," Jake whispered as they emerged from the service tunnel. "We need to find my parents quickly," Emily replied. "The longer we're here, the greater the chance we'll be discovered." They began a systematic search of the detention area, checking each cell for signs of occupancy. Most of the cells were empty, but several contained prisoners who appeared to be in various states of physical and psychological distress. In one cell, they found Dr. Michael Torres, the geologist who had disappeared from Rocky Mountain National Park 3 years earlier. He was thin and pale, but alive and conscious. When he saw the rescue team, his eyes filled with tears of relief and disbelief. "I never thought anyone would find us," he whispered. "They told us that the outside world had forgotten about us." "We're here to get you out," Emily said. "But first, I need to find my parents, David and Sarah Miller. Do you know where they are?" Dr. Torres nodded weakly. "They're in the high security section, 2 levels down. But Emily, you need to know. They've been here for a long time. The interrogations, the isolation, psychological pressure, it's taken a toll on them." Emily felt her heart sink, but she forced herself to stay focused on the mission. "Can you walk? We need to get everyone out of here." "I think so," Dr. Torres replied. "But there are others, at least a dozen prisoners in this section alone." The rescue mission suddenly became much more complex. Emily had been prepared to rescue her parents, but she hadn't anticipated finding so many other prisoners. Getting everyone out safely would require a much larger operation than they had planned. Marcus was already thinking tactically. "We can't evacuate everyone at once. We need to prioritize the most vulnerable prisoners and come back for the others." "No," Emily said firmly. "We're not leaving anyone behind. These people have been suffering for years because of the Guardians. We're going to get them all out." Jake looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Emily, that's a noble sentiment, but we don't have the resources for a mass evacuation. We need to be realistic about what we can accomplish." "Then we make it work," Emily replied. "We find a way." Dr. Williams had been studying the facility's layout on her tablet. "There's a loading dock on the ground level that connects to a service road. If we can get the prisoners to that location, we might be able to use vehicles to transport them to safety. That's assuming we can find vehicles and get past the security checkpoints," Marcus pointed out. "One problem at a time," Emily said. "First, let's find my parents and assess the situation with the other prisoners." They continued deeper into the facility, following Dr. Torres's directions to the high security section. This area was even more heavily fortified than the regular detention level, with additional security doors and surveillance cameras. As they approached the high security cells, Emily's heart began to race. After 2 years of searching, she was about to be reunited with her parents, but she was also terrified of what condition she might find them in. The first cell they checked contained a man Emily didn't recognize, but who appeared to be in serious medical distress. The second cell was empty. The third cell contained a woman who might have been Sarah Miller, but who was so thin and pale that Emily couldn't be sure. "Mom?" Emily whispered through the small window in the cell door. The woman looked up, and Emily saw her mother's eyes, looking back at her. But Sarah Miller was almost unrecognizable. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her face was gaunt and lined with stress and suffering. "Emily?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Mom. We're here to get you out." Sarah began to cry, and Emily felt her own tears starting to flow. But there was no time for an emotional reunion. They still needed to find David and get everyone to safety. Marcus was already working on the electronic lock that secured Sarah's cell. The lock was sophisticated, but he had come prepared with hacking equipment that could override most security systems. As the cell door opened, Sarah stumbled out and collapsed into Emily's arms. She was weak and disoriented, but alive and conscious. "Where's Dad?" Emily asked. "Next cell," Sarah whispered. "But Emily, he's not well. The interrogations, the drugs they gave him. He's not the same person he was." Emily's heart sank. To stay strong, but she forced herself. Whatever condition her father was in, she would deal with it. The important thing was getting him out of this place. David Miller was in the next cell, and Emily was shocked by his appearance. He had lost a tremendous amount of weight, and his hair had gone completely white. But more disturbing was the vacant expression in his eyes, as if he was looking at something that wasn't there. "Dad?" Emily said softly, as Marcus opened the cell door. David looked at her, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He seemed to be in some kind of dissociative state, possibly the result of psychological trauma or medication. "He's been like this for months," Sarah explained. "They gave him drugs to make him more compliant during the interrogations. I don't know if the effects are permanent." Emily felt a surge of rage at the people who had done this to her family. but she channeled that anger into determination. She would get her parents out of this place, and then she would make sure that everyone responsible paid for what they had done. The rescue team now had to deal with the challenge of evacuating not just Emily's parents, but also Dr. Torres and the other prisoners they had discovered. Many of the prisoners were in poor physical condition and would need medical attention. Some, like David Miller, were in psychological distress that made them difficult to manage. "We need to call for backup," Jake said. "This is beyond what our small team can handle." "No," Emily replied. "If we call for official help, the Guardians will be tipped off. They have people inside law enforcement and the military. We have to do this ourselves." Marcus was already thinking about logistics. "We can use the service tunnels to move the prisoners to the loading dock. From there, we can commandeer vehicles and make a run for the perimeter." "What about the guards?" Dr. Williams asked. "They're going to notice when a dozen prisoners go missing. That's why we need to move fast," Emily said. "Once we start the evacuation, we'll have maybe 30 minutes before they realize what's happening." The next hour was a blur of activity as the rescue team worked to evacuate the prisoners. They moved in small groups through the service tunnels, with Emily and her team providing guidance and support to the weakened captives. Some of the prisoners were in better condition than others and were able to move under their own power. But several, including David Miller, needed to be carried or supported by the rescue team members. As they reached the loading dock, Emily realized that their biggest challenge was still ahead of them. The dock was located at ground level, which meant they would be exposed to the facility's security systems and guard patrols. Marcus had scouted the area and identified several vehicles that could be used for the escape, but getting to the vehicles and starting them without triggering alarms would require precise timing and a bit of luck. "Remember," Emily said to the group of rescued prisoners, "once we start moving, we don't stop for anything. Stay together, stay quiet, and follow our lead." The escape began at exactly 2:30 a.m., during a shift change that would provide a brief window of reduced security coverage. Emily led the first group of prisoners across the open area to the vehicles, while Marcus and Jake provided cover and Dr. Williams helped the weaker prisoners. For a few minutes, it seemed like the plan was working perfectly. They reached the vehicles without being detected, and Marcus was able to start the engines using his electronic equipment. But as they were loading the last group of prisoners, a security guard rounded the corner of a nearby building and spotted them. "Hey, stop right there!" the guard shouted, reaching for his radio. Marcus reacted instantly, tackling the guard before he could call for backup. But the young commotion had attracted the attention of other guards, and within seconds, alarms were blaring throughout the facility. "Go! Go! Go!" Emily shouted, pushing the last prisoners into the vehicles. The convoy of stolen vehicles raced toward the facility's main gate, with Emily driving the lead vehicle and her parents in the passenger seats. Behind them, she could see security vehicles beginning to pursue them. The main gate was heavily fortified and normally would have been impossible to breach. But Marcus had prepared for this contingency by placing explosive charges at strategic points around the gate's support structure. As the convoy approached the gate, Marcus detonated the charges, creating a gap large enough for the vehicles to pass through. The explosion also disabled some of the facility's communication equipment, buying them precious time before reinforcements could be called. Once they were outside the facility's perimeter, the convoy split up to make pursuit more difficult. Emily drove her parents and 2 other prisoners toward a predetermined rendezvous point where allies were waiting with medical supplies and transportation to safety. As they drove through the desert night, Emily looked at her parents in the rearview mirror. Sarah was holding David's hand and speaking to him softly, trying to bring him back from whatever psychological prison he was trapped in. They had been rescued, but Emily knew that their ordeal was far from over. The physical and psychological damage inflicted by the Guardians would take time to heal, and there was still the matter of bringing the organization to justice. But for the first time in 2 years, Emily felt hope. Her family was together again, and the truth about the Guardians' conspiracy was finally going to be exposed to the world. The rescue mission had been successful, but it was only the beginning of a larger battle for justice and accountability. Emily Miller, the scared 12-year-old who had lost her parents in Yellowstone, had become a force to be reckoned with, and she was just getting started. The aftermath of the Nevada rescue operation sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Within hours of the successful evacuation, news of the Guardians' conspiracy began to leak to the media, despite desperate attempts by various agencies to contain the story. Emily Miller, now 17 and battle-hardened by her experiences, had become the public face of the survivors. She appeared on every major news program, telling the story of her parents' disappearance and the 2-year investigation that had led to the discovery of the Guardian's secret detention facilities. For too long, this organization has operated in the shadows, kidnapping and murdering innocent people to protect their illegal activities, Emily said during a primetime interview. They thought they could silence us, but they were wrong. The truth always finds a way to come out. The rescued prisoners were taken to a secure medical facility where they received treatment for the physical and psychological trauma they had endured. David Miller's condition was particularly concerning. The drugs and psychological manipulation he had been subjected to had left him in a dissociative state that doctors weren't sure was reversible. Sarah Miller, though physically weakened by her captivity, had retained her mental faculties and was able to provide detailed testimony about the Guardian's operations. Her account of the interrogation techniques and psychological torture used by the organization provided crucial evidence for the criminal investigation that was now underway. They wanted to know everything about David's research, Sarah told investigators. They had lists of other researchers and treasure hunters, and they were systematically tracking down anyone who might pose a threat to their operations. The investigation into the Guardians expanded rapidly as more evidence came to light. The documents recovered from the Montana and Nevada facilities revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, involving corrupt officials, military contractors, and wealthy individuals who had been using federal land for illegal mining and research operations. Agent Sarah Chen, who had been investigating the case from the beginning, was put in charge of a joint task force that included representatives from the FBI, the Department of Justice, and military intelligence. The scope of the investigation was unprecedented, involving hundreds of agents and analysts working around the clock to unravel the conspiracy. What we've uncovered is not just a criminal organization, but a shadow government that has been operating parallel to our legitimate institutions for decades, Agent Chen explained during a classified briefing. They have infiltrated law enforcement, the military, and even Congress itself. The first arrests came within a week of the rescue operation. Hank and Jedediah Stone, the enforcers who had been directly responsible for David and Sarah Miller's kidnapping, were captured at a safe house in Montana. Under interrogation, they revealed the names of their handlers and the structure of the Guardians organization. The Stone brothers' testimony led to a series of raids on Guardians facilities across the western United States. Each raid uncovered more evidence of the organization's illegal activities, including documents that revealed the true scope of their mining operations on federal land. The Guardians had been using their network of front companies to conduct illegal mining operations in national parks and wilderness areas for over 30 years. They had extracted millions of dollars worth of gold, silver, and rare earth minerals from protected lands, using sophisticated techniques to hide their activities from satellite surveillance and park rangers. But the mining operations were just one part of their business model. The Guardians had also been involved in arms trafficking, money laundering, and the development of experimental weapons systems for foreign governments. Their detention facilities had been used not just to silence researchers and activists, but also to interrogate foreign agents and conduct illegal human experimentation. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the Guardians had connections to some of the most powerful people in the country. Several prominent politicians, military officers, and business leaders were implicated in the conspiracy, leading to a political scandal that dominated headlines for months. The man known as the Director, who had been the leader of the Guardians organization, was eventually identified as retired General Marcus Blackwood, a decorated military officer who had used his connections and security clearance to build a criminal empire. Blackwood had been operating under multiple identities for years, using his military background to recruit personnel and acquire equipment for the Guardians' operations. When federal agents finally tracked down Blackwood, they found him at a heavily fortified compound in Wyoming, surrounded by loyal followers who were prepared to fight to the death to protect their leader. The siege lasted for 3 days and ended only when Blackwood took his own life rather than face capture and prosecution. With Blackwood's death, the Guardians organization began to collapse. Without their charismatic leader, the various cells and front companies that made up the conspiracy started to turn on each other. Lower-level operatives began cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, providing even more evidence of the organization's crimes. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Over 200 people were eventually charged with crimes ranging from kidnapping and murder to treason and conspiracy against the United States. The trials revealed the full extent of the Guardians' activities and the damage they had inflicted on countless innocent victims. Emily Miller testified at several of the trials, providing powerful and emotional accounts of her family's ordeal. Her testimony was instrumental in securing convictions against many of the defendants, including the Stone brothers, who were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "Justice has finally been served," Emily said after the final verdicts were announced. "But no amount of punishment can undo the suffering that these people caused. The important thing is that we've exposed the truth and prevented them from hurting anyone else." The revelation of the Guardian's conspiracy led to significant reforms in how the federal government monitors and protects public lands. New oversight mechanisms were put in place to prevent similar organizations from operating in the future, and additional resources were allocated to investigating and prosecuting crimes against federal property. The rescued prisoners, meanwhile, began the long process of rebuilding their lives. Some, like Dr. Michael Torres, were able to return to their careers and families with minimal long-term effects from their captivity. Others required extensive medical and psychological treatment to recover from their ordeal. David Miller's recovery was the most challenging. The psychological trauma and drug-induced damage to his brain had left him with severe memory problems and difficulty processing information. He required round-the-clock care and might never fully recover his previous mental capabilities. But there were signs of progress. With the help of experimental treatments and the loving support of his family, David began to show moments of clarity and recognition. He was able to remember fragments of his life before the kidnapping, and he gradually began to rebuild his relationship with Emily and Sarah. "He's not the same person he was before," Sarah admitted during a follow-up interview. "But he's still my husband and Emily's father. We're grateful to have him back, regardless of his condition." Emily, now 18 and preparing to enter college, had decided to study journalism and criminal justice. Her experiences had given her a unique perspective on the importance of investigative reporting and the need for accountability in government and law enforcement. "I want to make sure that stories like ours don't get buried or forgotten," she explained. "There are probably other conspiracies out there, other organizations that think they can operate above the law. Someone needs to be watching and investigating, and I want to be part of that effort." The Yellowstone vanishing, as the case came to be known, became a landmark in the history of criminal justice and government accountability. It demonstrated the power of persistent investigation and the importance of never giving up in the search for truth. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of federal lands to exploitation by criminal organizations and the need for better protection of the researchers and activists who work to preserve these precious resources. For Emily Miller, the resolution of her parents' case marked the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. She had transformed from a scared 12-year-old into a formidable advocate for justice and truth. Her story inspired a generation of young people to become involved in investigative journalism and criminal justice reform. The Miller family's ordeal had lasted for over 2 years, but their story of survival, determination, and ultimate triumph over evil would be remembered for generations to come. It proved that even the most powerful and secretive organizations could not escape justice when faced with the unwavering determination of those who refused to be silenced. In the end, the Yellowstone vanishing became more than just a missing persons case. It became a symbol of the power of truth over deception, of justice over corruption, and of the unbreakable bonds of family love that can survive even the most horrific ordeals. The vast wilderness of Yellowstone, where the story began, remained as beautiful and mysterious as ever. But now it also served as a reminder that even in the most remote and protected places on Earth, vigilance is required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit and harm them. David and Sarah Miller had set out on a simple family hike in 2009, never imagining that their love of adventure and discovery would lead them into the heart of a deadly conspiracy. But their courage and their daughter's determination had ultimately exposed one of the most significant criminal organizations in American history. Their story would be told and retold for years to come, inspiring others to never give up hope and to always fight for the truth, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. The Yellowstone vanishing had ended, but its legacy would live on forever.